Welcome to our call on promoting AI innovation through competition. I'm Teddy Downey, executive editor here at the Capital Forum. And today's guest is Jack Corrigan, a senior research analyst at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. He'll be talking with us about his recent paper, Promoting AI Innovation Through Competition, a guide to managing market power. It's really an excellent paper. You rarely see, especially in these nascent markets, a really thorough, holistic analysis of market power. I can't recommend the paper enough. Please download it, read it. It's excellent. Hopefully you've already read it so that you can engage in the conversation. But Jack, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
And I'm gonna start off with some questions. We'll get to your questions. If you have any, please put them in the questions pane in the control panel, or email them to editorial@thecapitalforum.com. And Jack, I think normally I ask like, oh well, why did you write this paper? I mean, I think it's kind of obvious why you wrote the paper, but I would love to get into the methodology. Like, how did you do the research? How did you come up with a plan to really understand each layer of the market here?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'll zoom out a bit, and I guess talk a little bit about the origin of the paper because it's kind of related. So I had been pretty interested in looking at kind of competition and innovation in the AI space really since I started at CSET in 2021. And at the time, this is kind of pre-Chat GPT, pre the whole generative AI boom. AI was still kind of this niche technology that was really, there were a lot of people who were pretty engaged on the space, but the community was fairly small. And the tech itself was, it showed a lot of promise, but in these kind of like discrete application areas. And at the same time, you saw a lot of, because it was relatively small, and the commercial industry hadn't like taken off in the way that it has recently. You saw kind of a lot of players in this space in academia and industry. The big tech companies were involved, but you had all of these other kind of like small shops that were also working in this space. And then kind of late 2022, when you saw, Chat GPT came out, this whole, generative AI kind of became part of the zeitgeist. You really saw it transform from this niche technology with like these kinds of discrete applications to the conversation really focusing on, this is like going to be this all-powerful system that's going to completely transform the way that like we live our lives, the way we organize the economy, the way we run our politics. You might remember some of the kind of like apocalyptic language around that time. It just became this much bigger thing, and you saw all this money pouring into it. And I think that for me, the first glance that I got at the way that the industry was going to be shaping was this the partnership between OpenAI and Microsoft. So here you have, this was months after ChatGPT had come out, the kind of like breakout star of the whole generative AI boom thought it was in their best interest to latch themselves to one of these incumbent tech companies, give them a huge stake in it, give them access to their tech, that kind of thing. And to me, that really that raised some red flags, just because it's like, this should be, if there is any company that is able to make it out on their own, it should be this company, this lab that built this incredible tool that tens and hundreds of millions of people were using, but they didn't see a path forward. And then just the more I thought about it, I kind of poked around. You had a lot of people kind of focusing on, at the time, the capabilities and the risks of AI systems, but not a lot of attention being directed towards market power. So to Georgetown's credit, kind of they let me kind of go forth and just do my own research and poke around and stuff. And as you saw more of these partnerships form, as you saw kind of the market structure crystallize, you started to see how a lot of the inputs to AI development really were either directly controlled by some of these big tech companies, or the way that AI was being developed was structured in a way that gave these companies a pretty big advantage. So I kind of got interested in that, and then honestly, like, there was a lot of kind of within the last 2 years, some great work coming out looking at kind of the AI tech stack, where a lot of the power was concentrated. But I didn't see, and that was kind of a lot of that was happening within academia. And we at Georgetown, we're a think tank that kind of straddles the line between the national security community and the tech policy community. And I didn't see a ton of that discourse kind of like making it through to the audiences that we reach. So with this report, my goal was basically to take a lot of this, a lot of the work that had been done kind of looking at the AI tech stack and frame it in ways that would resonate with this audience that we would reach, that was, you know, deeply interested in AI, had a lot of money that they were spending on AI, had a lot of interest in where the tech was going to go, but didn't have a deep, like super deep expertise in some of the competition issues around there. So I think that, you know, methodology wise, I honestly, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants who did a lot of this work ahead of me. But I think what I was trying to add with this report was kind of like reframing some of these competition issues in a way that looked at things that national security leaders were concerned about, which are, you know, innovation, resiliency, and you know, democratic governance. And I think that, you know, through the work that we had done, the top line finding of the report is that if left unchecked, you're going to see this industry really continue to consolidate around these big tech companies, and that's going to make it less innovative, less resilient to disruptions and technological surprises, and less responsive to democratic governance efforts.
At the beginning of the piece, you go through, you sort of lay out like, look, here are the stakes. Here's why competition is useful from a national security standpoint. I mean, I think it's worth just touching on that briefly before we get into the meat, because, you know, obviously it was important enough that you led off the piece with that, but also I think it's useful refresher, you know, useful to sort of go, you did some homework, you did your history when you wrote that, and so useful to kind of go over that for the audience.
For sure, yeah. So I again, I'll kind of frame it in terms of the buckets. So the things that I was looking at were like competition impacts on innovation, competition impacts on resiliency, and then competition impacts on governance. And I think the one in the report, we focus pretty heavily on the innovation side of it, because there's a lot of great literature there. I think the thing here is, you know, innovation, like everyone in a market operates by different incentives. And I think that when you look at, you know, really concentrated markets, you have, you know, these kind of big incumbent firms that we're kind of seeing emerge in AI. You know, they are operating by very different incentives than startups. They are going to be investing in things that are, you know, kind of these incremental developments on their existing business lines, things that might not push the envelope as much as you might see from a startup that's really trying to break into the space and kind of disrupt a new industry. And when you look at AI, like the technology is, you know, it feels like it's been around for a very long time because there's been so much coverage, but it's still this very new tech. And if you look at the way that even in the last 10 years, the technology has progressed, you've seen this kind of like movement through different, you know, AI paradigms where you have some breakthrough that enables a lot of innovation to happen up to a point, and then you have another breakthrough, and it kind of just keeps moving in this staggered direction. And I think that if you rely too heavily on incumbent firms, like you're not going to see that kind of steady stream of breakthroughs in the way that we would want to see from a national security perspective. It's to kind of keep the U.S. at the technological edge. And I think, you know, I've been working on this paper before all the DeepSeek stuff happened, but for folks who followed that story, I think that kind of drove home this idea that, you know, there are certain things that incumbents might not want to do or might underinvest in, that might be because it's not necessarily as beneficial for them as it would be for society. So here with DeepSeek, what you had was this Chinese AI developer that basically came up with this much cheaper way of building models that were able to perform at a level roughly comparable to some of the top models that were on the market already. And then they opened up that tool, they opened up the model in a way that a lot of these kind of US tech companies had been reluctant to do. So this was, you know, and if you had a more kind of competitive ecosystem in the US where that sort of thing was being encouraged, you might have seen that kind of breakthrough happen, you know, here rather than across the Pacific. And then just to get into some of the homework there, if you look back on history, like I think the Bell Labs example comes up very often, where you had, here was this great lab at AT&T that was doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and a lot of the tools that we rely on very heavily today, semiconductors, those types of things got their start at Bell Labs. But we did not see AT&T commercialize those tools. Like the basic research was done there, but it wasn't until the DOJ stepped in and came, struck this consent decree and forced AT&T to open up that IP that we saw a lot of this kind of like downstream innovation happening. So I think that that story really resonated with me. I think that it resonates with a lot of national security folks. So I really wanted to kind of drive that home and just talk about the importance of having actors in a space that are trying to disrupt kind of existing ways of doing things. And then just to I know I'm rambling at you, but to briefly touch on kind of the resiliency and the democratic governance stuff, I think that when you think about resiliency, you want to have a pretty diversified array of actors participating in the space, just because if something goes wrong, the impacts won't ripple out as much as they would if you were relying on one or two really big players. I think we saw, if you think back to the kind of CrowdStrike outage that we saw, I forget how long ago that was, maybe a year or two, that you saw just the ripple effects of like a one kind of flaw in a specific system, like take down airports and all these other industries. I think you could see a similar thing if we rely too heavily on a particular AI tool, where if something goes wrong there, like the ripple effects could be huge. And then I think if you look at the democratic governance stuff, when you have a more diversified, contestable, competitive ecosystem, the companies are less able to kind of like either block, influence, or shape any kind of governance efforts in their favor, just because there will be more alternatives, people who would be willing to comply with these regulations or these other governance efforts that are being put forth. So I think just all of the, I think there's many different angles to beyond just these kinds of like innovation, resiliency, governance stuff, but I think that within the national security community, that's the stuff that really resonates.
I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about your rigorous approach and doing all this research. It just cuts through so much of the inane propaganda that you hear a lot from sort of the establishment Washington community, that nothing can happen to no rules, no enforcement to big tech, because that will weaken it, the US internationally, and is a national security risk, will somehow lose out to China. But obviously if you do a modicum of research, and obviously you did a lot of research here, pretty poke a lot of holes in that thesis. Do you still hear, really, we don't have to stay on this, do you still hear that? I get it, I'm in this world, I hear it a lot, but is that still kind of the main talking point that you hear from big tech at this point, or is it kind of, has the conversation just fundamentally evolved past that?
I unfortunately wouldn't say the conversation's totally evolved past that. I think that a lot of this, at least within some of the community, the folks that I've interacted with, a lot of credence is given to this idea that we need these massive companies to compete against China specifically. And I think that we don't need to get super into the weeds if it's not of interest to you, but I think that there's the dynamic has somewhat shifted recently away from this, we need, just dominant firms because we want dominant firms. It's really shifted towards, I don't know how much you followed the kind of like AGI discussion, but there's this idea that, the way that AI progress is going to happen is by continuing to basically just build bigger and bigger and bigger systems. So it's just this idea of scale. That's going to be the way towards like artificial general intelligence, which has become like a real focus within the national security and kind of broader policy community. And when you frame it through that way, it kind of takes this, what would seem to be a pretty self-serving argument where it's like, oh, don't touch us because, you need us to beat China just by virtue of us being great and us being us. And they're saying, actually, no, this particular, there is a technological angle to bigness. There's a technological benefit to having this massive concentration of financial assets, technical assets, because that's the way that progress is going to happen. And I think, we can pick apart that argument in depth, but I think that has become kind of like the focal point of this argument that for kind of leaving big tech alone is that.
Well, as you mentioned, it seems like DeepSeek pretty solidly put a hole in that point. I mean, you can't really, we don't even need to we don't really even need to do any history. You already basically proved that that's just flat out not true. There's value in these smaller players and in making big improvements, really, much more efficient. But I think we can kind of pick apart at this as we get through the paper.
Sure.
I want to get into the 3 layers, but actually first you mentioned something that I thought was interesting. You said, ChatGPT, like the lifeline was Microsoft, right? Coming in, effectively buying them. I mean, I don't really understand the difference between taking 75% of your profits, 50% of your profits in perpetuity or whatever. What is the difference between buying someone and that? I intellectually cannot, I'm not smart enough to figure that out. But I guess like a couple quick questions there. One is Silicon Valley, is VC just completely useless at this point? Like, how could they not have any money? Is there something really broken about the VC community that, I have my, concerns or skepticism about the long-term value of a ChatGPT or what have you? Are they just stealing a lot of copyrighted material? Like, what is this based on? And what is the real utility of it? And like, is it making people dumber? I have a lot of my own personal concerns about it in terms of the value, but like, obviously, if you're getting that many users, you should get money, right? Like, you should get some VC money, right? Obviously, it's worth 10 billion or whatever, fine, you're getting credits from Microsoft, but it's worth billions of dollars, right? How is VC not showing up? And how is it not like, and I guess the other question is, if the FTC had said, hey, Microsoft, no, you cannot effectively acquire this, do you think it would have gotten VC money? And do you think there is value in it being independent? Or like, was there an alternative? Like, have we already actually made a big mistake? Has the FTC and DOJ, by allowing all big tech, the vertically integrated big tech, to come in and partner with, I mean, buy, or essentially whatever, take a huge amount of equity in these companies, that we're already, behind the 8 ball here?
Right. It's a very interesting question, and I don't want to dodge it, but I think there's some like credence to the argument that an OpenAI almost needed Microsoft to step in order to stay in business. Like, that's one side where it's like, oh, again, because the technology, because the kind of foundation model was developed in this way that requires so much compute, and that compute is so expensive. And there was no, and again, like, one aspect to this is I agree that these companies should be able to make money, but there's still no real clear tried and true path to monetizing these AI tools. Even today, you have a bunch of companies kind of scrambling to kind of find a business model there, but especially in late 2022, it was pretty unclear. So I think at the time it made sense both for Microsoft and for OpenAI to kind of engage in this partnership. And I think that the FTC, rightfully, I think, has scrutinized that partnership and some of these others and are paying very, very close attention to it. So I guess I don't want to say that we've completely kind of fallen behind the 8 ball on it yet, but I think where we are now starting to see the kind of pernicious effects of these partnerships is that instead of running into these very high costs, running into these technical barriers, and having that be an incentive to develop very, very cheap or more efficient ways of doing AI, these partnerships have kind of enabled this relentless pursuit of scale, and allowed companies to basically continue doing AI down this path that is becoming enormously costly, both in terms of money and in terms of environmental impacts. And I think that is kind of where for me at least, some of the kind of broader downsides are for the development of the tech, is that we probably would not have been able to continue developing the tech down that path as far as we have if those kinds of partnerships were prohibited or otherwise disincentivized.
But I mean, we already got DeepSeek. You already, and if your incentive is use more compute, I mean, you already have a bad incentive here, which is a lot of the money is actually in credits for compute.
Right.
And so there's no actual interest in being more efficient. It's just use more compute, get a nuclear facility. It's not, hey, we need, if the VC puts in 10 billion, and by the way, they were very patient with Amazon. Amazon lost money for a long, long time, right? And so losing money and throwing more money at a growing user base technology that is, at least everyone else thinks is transformative. Again, I have my personal, sort of skepticism there,
right.
But plenty of people are excited about this technology. And then, obviously the incentives are different. If you have $10 billion of VC with no credits,
Mm-hmm.
you want to A, figure out a business model, and B, be more efficient with the compute, right? Bring down your costs and bring up your revenues. And also, and like you said, the externality here is insane use of energy.
Right.
So there's an environmental problem with that inherent incentive to just use more compute. So I mean, look, anyway, we don't have to stay on this because obviously we're not going to solve how broken the VC community is, that ChatGPT can get money on its own. But I think that's kind of an interesting question that we can, potentially come back to at some point, which is we'll see what the FTC ends up coming up with around the Microsoft acquisition. But that when you said that, I had, when I read the paper, obviously you mentioned that, right? You mentioned the details of the Microsoft acquisition and the incentives of big tech, but I hadn't quite put it together that there was a little shift in how the market would operate at that very moment, at least in the US. Is that fair to say, or am I overstating this?
I think that's fair to say, and I think that the real question comes down to had Microsoft not stepped in, and again, I agree with everything that you're saying. It's a very valid point. But the question kind of at the time was, are we cool letting OpenAI, which has achieved this breakthrough, potentially flop, in order to prevent Microsoft from gaining outsized influence over the company? And I think that's an open question. It's if OpenAI wasn't able to attract the VC money that it needed. Also, I'll just also add that prior to the Microsoft partnership, Microsoft was also a very significant investor in OpenAI. So there was already a pre-existing relationship between those two companies. But I agree. I mean, had OpenAI gone under, you could have had, all of its employees, like they could have gone out and started these new things and found more efficient ways of doing things where they wouldn't need to be as beholden to, a cloud company as they are now. I agree with that, but I think that
it's just a fundamentally broken capital markets in the
right.
US if ChatGPT cannot get, like, whether I mean, someone needs to be, they should be, I mean, I don't understand how they can't attract money except from a vertically integrated company with, that can cross subsidize it. But
They're still
that,
losing money
yeah.
too, which is, I think, the business, and I think that like a key thing here, like part of the reason that the industry has become so concentrated is that like maybe, and maybe this is a problem with the VC industry, is that like there is no like clear path to profitability for any of these companies. So the only ones who are able to take on these massive costs with no like clear upside is, some of these big tech firms.
Let's get into, get into these layers. Let's talk about these layers, because I found this really interesting. And like we could spend, look, we're already halfway through. We could spend all day talking about all these layers and all the, but I want to get to the main choke points in each layer and then sort of get your holistic assessment of the problems going forward. But let's start with the infrastructure layer. You broke things into 3 layers: infrastructure layer, model layer, application layer. Let's start with the infrastructure layer, and then, where you found the sort of key, choke point there. And then we'll get to, maybe we could just progress to the model layer and the application layer.
Sure, that sounds good. And I guess before we dive into each of these layers, I'll just say kind of like the holistic idea for each of these is that the way that AI is being developed gives an enormous, it relies on, or it gives an enormous advantage to these incumbent firms because of their existing businesses. So they are able to use their existing collections of assets in ways that give them both directly a pretty significant competitive advantage in AI development and a lot of control over the market. So when you look at the infrastructure layer, if you think about AI systems, one of the big inputs is compute. When you're building an AI model, when you're training an AI model, you need a lot of compute power, particularly when you're building these really large kind of like foundation models that undergird the whole thing. And buying that compute is very expensive. So what a lot of developers will do is use cloud computing. And the cloud computing market is highly concentrated. Amazon, Google, Microsoft collectively control like 2/3 of the global cloud market, probably higher for US AI companies, just for different reasons. And through that control of the compute power, they themselves are able to build AI systems using compute at marginal cost, and then are able to charge a premium to all of the users that use their platforms. And it really can be, a choke point because they basically set the terms upon which all of these other developers can access this really critical input. So as you mentioned, with a lot of these partnerships, what those effectively were these companies giving these sweetheart deals to these developers in exchange for like some stake in the company. And they were very heavily, like a lot of them were based pretty heavily on compute credits. So it's basically like, here's a finite amount of like free compute power that you could use to build your thing. Obviously a company that has that is going to be at a much, a clear advantage against a company that needs to pay, whatever these, the firms are charging their kind of everyday customers. And then when you think about just the structure of the cloud market, there's a lot of competition if you're like a developer looking at the outset for a provider. But once you choose a cloud provider, you are locked into that cloud provider just by virtue of some of these like technical barriers to migration and other kind of artificial barriers that the cloud providers will erect through like egress fees and some of the other contractual terms.
Can we stay on that for a second, because we've spent some time looking at those contractual terms. You mentioned that the Microsoft OpenAI agreement is an exclusive, they're their exclusive cloud provider, right?
So that's changed since then. I think.
Okay. But in terms of the exclusivity, or those contractual obligations, and also, there are other lock-in, right? Like you mentioned the paper, and I'm curious if there's any contractual language around this also, but typically you're going to layer on the developer tools to the, you use the developer tools that you get from your cloud provider. That's
Right.
not like an open market either. And so there are just all these lock-in effects. Is that something, did you think about that as a choke point, or itself, like those agreements, or those, the sort of the tying and bundling together of all these things when you choose your cloud provider? I mean, and then, but I just want to talk about that for a second, because that seems like there's a lot going on there with, exactly how did these, when you choose your cloud provider, how easy or hard is it to get out if you want to switch?
Yeah, so I'll say a lot of these contracts are not public, so I'm not super familiar with the different provisions. But I think you're right to point out how once you are in, there are all kinds of direct and indirect forces kind of keeping you there. I think the developer tools is a big one. I did some separate research with another colleague of mine looking at the way that these different companies are investing in kind of infrastructure expansions and then the creation of these open source software packages, these developer tools. And the idea there is that when you build these developer tools and a particular developer gets used to using those tools, and then they have to switch to another cloud provider, they're going to have to learn a whole new set of skills and a whole new set of tools, and that itself is kind of like a barrier to entry. If you look at a lot of the infrastructure expansions that these companies are making kind of across the globe, they often include workforce development programs, meaning that it's like, hey, we'll build you this data center here, and then we'll train up like 100,000 developers on how to use our stuff. And the idea there is that once you train those developers, it's like those become kind of customers for life. So I think that bundling, we didn't really look at it in the report as much, but I think that bundling there has a huge impact on the ability of a particular company to migrate from one cloud to another. And I'll just touch on it here. I think there's also some very technical barriers to just like retooling your system for a new cloud, because there's not a lot of interoperability between these cloud platforms. And there have been proposals to kind of mandate interoperability as a way to make cloud companies a little more, or incentivize competition between them a little more.
And what about, you talk about national security or resiliency, isn't it more of a risk if you're all loaded up in one cloud provider, as opposed to a multi-cloud, system, obviously that becomes more complicated, and it's harder if it's not, interoperability and things like that. But isn't that just like intellectually seems like you're going to be more resilient if you can, not be totally reliant on one cloud provider?
100%. Yeah, and actually, if you look at the government, a lot of agencies will require kind of these multi-cloud environments for a particular program or a particular system to have that kind of resiliency. And right now we just don't have as much of that in the private sector, at least in the.
Yeah. And I think, and by the way, I want to give a quick shout out to your image. I basically have this image up on my desk at all times at this point. It is so well done. You've got the choke point between the cloud computing platform and the model layer. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you think about that in particular being the choke point there.
For sure. So if you think about, again, building an AI model, it's like you need a lot of compute, and then you also need the algorithms and the data to all kind of come together to build an AI system. And because of the way that, as we talked about earlier, because of the way that AI is kind of being developed today with these big scale, this kind of like bigger is better idea, building these really big foundation models is very expensive. And very few, like for the most part, the top models in the US at least are these models that have been developed by these incumbent firms. So when I think about kind of the model layer, especially as of late, I've been thinking more about if I'm a developer and I'm trying to access a foundation model and fine tune it so I get to a particular application. that there's this choke point where, again, I need to rely not only on the compute power from one of these companies, but probably one of the foundation models from one of these companies. And again, the incumbent firm gets to determine the terms upon which I access that model, the extent of tinkering that I could do with that model, the amount of auditing that I could do to kind of understand how that model is working, kind of under the hood. And that again is just another point at which these firms can squeeze their customers. I also, you need data to train these models, and these firms have access to massive troves of proprietary data that they can distribute as they see fit. So again, that's a way that they could, kind of pick and choose which developers might have an advantage in the market. And then if we can we'll go down, I guess, I think the application layer.
They interact. So let's go down. Yeah, let's talk more about oh yeah. Let's talk about the whole thing. Yeah.
I think I'm so happy to see it kind of like getting more attention now, but this final choke point is the distribution channels for AI systems. So it's like, once you build you could build a system and it's all, that's all well and good, but if you're a developer, you're not going to be able to build a successful business unless you're able to get that get your tool in front of a customer. And the channels through which developers access customers are also themselves like pretty much controlled by a lot of these large tech platforms that have over the last 15 years kind of come to dominate these different corners of the digital economy. So if you're looking at consumer applications of AI, the way that you or I might access one of these tools is through an app store, through a smartphone, through a web browser, through a social media platform. Again, like there's one or two big players in each of those spaces, and they have, they could, through self-preferencing, through bundling, through all of these other things, kind of like put their model or their preferred model, in an advantageous position on those platforms. And then I think another area that has not gotten a ton of attention yet, but I think is going to be extremely relevant as AI tools become more broadly adopted, are some of these B2B distribution channels. So if you're a business that's using AI, you probably already use a cloud provider. And the AI tools that you are going to access are going to be the ones that are provided through that cloud environment in which you're used to operating. And if you look at the way that these kinds of these cloud environments are structured, the interface for these software tools looks very, very similar to app stores, to online retail marketplaces, all of these different platforms where we are pretty aware of how they can be structured in a way that advantages certain products over another. So there's just many opportunities through these distribution channels for these companies to preference their whatever model or product they want to get in front of people. And it's just there's a lot of ways that other developers can be squeezed.
Did you think about how, if there's a race to the bottom from a competition standpoint, where you're sort of incentivized right now to try to violate IP, right? Like obviously there's costs associated with that, right? Eventually you're going to lose billions and potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in copyright lawsuits.
Sure.
But right now, you're sort of incentivized in some ways. Your model might perform better if you're using proprietary copyright material. And does that, is it, and obviously that could, if it undermines the news industry, could be a threat to democracy long term. So does that, when you think about national security, is the pirating and stealing of copyright to, as an input in a model, is it a national security issue?
I think so. I'll admit I hadn't, we don't really touch on this in the report, and I haven't looked into this as much as I should, but I think on an intellectual level, it makes a lot of sense if you believe that a free press is essential to democracy, that open, honest discourse and truth is important to the democratic process, then I think that any behavior that undermines that is a national security risk.
it just seems like, having to wait for copyright lawsuits to play out as a way to punish the people that are stealing the IP, potentially, I think there's a lot of value, from that standpoint in, what, like the FTC, if they did let's say they did a 6B, and they're like, I need to see these models. And then you just got a little bit of you got some subpoenas, you got some, or state AGs start having a concern. It seems like there could be at least, at some point, at least some pressure to, compete on quality where you're, all right, I license this legally. This is a legal, higher quality product where you're not violating any IP. You don't have to worry about violating IP
Right.
because, like, we account for that.
Mhm.
But unless, if it's, the disconnect between the timing of a copyright lawsuit and when, I mean, eventually it'll come out, but you could already have just the big first mover advantage if you've been doing it and everyone starts using your app because it's like better because it has a lot of this copyright material in it. Anyway, have you thought about like what, when you're thinking about solutions, government investigations,
Mhm.
to address all these choke points, how do you think about, like, what is the first step getting access to these contracts so you can see exactly how the leverage is being used? Or what do you think about in terms of like how to get at the problem that the choke points are creating, or the potential future leverage that you talk about in the report of, the vertically integrated big tech over the more specialized AI
Mhm.
companies that don't have all that, they're not like comprehensively vertically integrated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I agree. I think that um, transparency in whatever way we can get it is an absolutely crucial first step, because a lot of this report is just kind of speculating on ways that this power can be exerted, and then we have a few kind of like concrete examples, particularly related to the compute stuff. But I think that the more that we can look under the hood for the business models, how the models themselves are being developed, how copyrighted information is being used or not used, I think that's all incredibly helpful. But I think that in the process, like we should do that. We should absolutely do that. And I think in addition to it, like we really need to just understand. I think the distribution channel aspect is something that we already do kind of understand. Like we've seen how these platforms can be manipulated in different ways to give preference to certain products over others. Like I think that the whole, the Google search case, like that was really the crux of that. We there've been a bunch of investigations into what Amazon was doing on its marketplace to prefer certain products over others. And I think that cracking down on that kind of behavior would really create space for these other types of tools that might be more, more respectful of copyrighted information, or better in all of these other ways, both in performance and in terms of their social impacts. Like that would allow them to compete on the merits, because right now it's like you can develop one of those systems, but it could be great, it could perform better, it could be more or less, there's less legal liability. But given all of these other ways that the companies can exert control over the market and the different advantages that these companies have, like different developers have, I don't know that they would even that they'd be able to compete on the merits. So I think that I hope this answers your question a little bit, but I think
Yeah.
transparency, like transparency would help us kind of target interventions. But I think that even now it's like, particularly on the distribution channel side, like we kind of know what needs to be done. We have a rough idea of the way that market power would manifest itself. And I think that stepping in there would be a good thing that we could do in the short term.
So, obviously a lot of way that Google sort of locked in its market power, it was with these defaults, right? Was
Yeah, yeah.
understanding the value of the defaults. And if you think of, ChatGPT and AI chatbots and things like that as maybe not a total replacement, but a slight alternative to search or sort of search-like in like how people use it. It's like you go there, you want to get information, you type it in, you're going to stick with your default probably. Obviously, what are you talking, just like antitrust enforcers being super vigilant about default agreements and sort of trying to prohibit those? What are there other ways that we're talking? I mean, obviously we could go through the App Store and all the different types of distribution channels, but it just given that things are kind of that are sort of free-ish now, the way that they're operating, is that Google default analogy probably the best one in terms of like what to watch out for, or are there other things that you're seeing that, hey, this is going on? And you mentioned the app markets, online marketplaces, we've got the tried and true strategies. All of these companies are being super antitrust right now, but I guess except for Microsoft. But what else do you see besides defaults, or what if you had to kind of come up with a top 3 or 4 to be on the lookout for, or to do some enforcement on? What would you suggest?
I think, I think the defaults are a big one. I think that not to just kind of regurgitate what I've already said, but I think that like the self-preferencing on consumer app markets is big. I think that the self-preferencing on kind of these B2B marketplaces is big. I think that looking for the sorts of like scrutinizing the kind of pay-to-play stuff that we've seen on I guess the Amazon store would be important. I think scrutinizing, I think what else, like the challenge here is that, again, the AI market is so young. The way that I think about it is like I recognize
you're looking at the leverage and you're saying, hey, there's going to be a lot of ways that they can use this leverage in the future. That's really the crux of the paper.
Right. And it's like we don't want to, like, to some degree, like all of these examples are fighting the last war, because we've already seen like the ways that market power can manifest, and I guess I see a lot of similar ways that it can manifest in the AI space, but we don't yet really know how AI tools are going to be used. We don't know what what industries are going to be most prevalent in quite yet. And I think that just like maintaining vigilance and maintaining a basic understanding of where these companies have power in the supply chain and different ways that they could exert it, I think is for the best. I feel like that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but
it's an interesting market in that when you write this paper, right, and I'm reading it, there's a lot of mentions of exclusive dealing. Time. I mean, and you don't necessarily always call it tying and bundling, but tying and bundling. I mean, it's like at every layer, there's lots of this going on. And so if you think about restraints of trade, there are just so many already. So it's not like, I feel like it's not like you'd have there's a lot of material for DOJ and FTC to work with here.
Very much so.
Already without without necessarily having it be a mature market. I mean, that's in some respects a result of what you said earlier, and we kind of get back to this initial point, which is if you don't have all of these companies operating independently, they're all connected. I mean, and we've tried to look, if you look at the myriad ways that big tech is already intertwined with a lot of these sort of those sort of sort of innovative smaller AI firms. I mean, it's a crazy level of entanglement. So it's probably a function of that in some respects. Whereas if you had a lot of independent companies with independent money, you probably you'd have less of that kind of material to work with potentially, because like you don't. I actually even wonder like how many multi-cloud AI software companies are there, right? They're all kind of like tied in with their specific cloud provider, right?
Right. There's a few that have struck these partnerships with, I think Anthropic was working with, I don't know if they're still working with Google and Amazon, but that was one. But your point's taken. The vast majority are very much integrated with a single provider. And that gives them a lot of opportunity to kind of co-opt the work that's being done externally and do all the tying and bundling that we've been talking about, self-reference, like all of it.
And AI does come up a little bit in a lot of these cases that are already ongoing. It's come up in Google, in terms of what the remedies should be. Just having looked at this and not, as you point out, kind of fighting the last war, do you think the remedies in these big tech in this big tech litigation should try to address this, any kinds of conflicts of interest and things like that in the AI market, as a way to deal with this potential problem down the road? Or do you see it more as like, hey, no, we got to do another, we got to take another crack at this? And
I think no, I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways that we could structure remedies in current cases to prevent kind of like these extensions into the AI market. And I think that hopefully this report, by tying it to some of the behavior that they've already done, kind of helps see where the AI angle might come in on some of these remedies. I think that one thing that's come up recently that I think is somewhat related to this is and I guess this would be kind of a new thing, but Meta announced this, partnership, quote unquote, that they were going to have with Scale AI. I think it was on the order of like $14 billion or something. Don't quote me on that, but it's I mean, Scale AI, their business is effectively like data annotation and organizing this deeply unsexy but extremely important part of the AI production process. They're like the really big player there. And if that falls under the control of Facebook, to whether directly or indirectly, again, these partnerships are kind of gray on that in that area. But like that again is just another way that these companies can exert market power. And again, it looks very, very similar to what Facebook had done with WhatsApp and Instagram. And I think because of the way the deal was structured, it might not warrant like the same kind of scrutiny that a more traditional M&A deal would get. But again, it's just like they are doing a lot of the same. So they are rerunning the playbook that they have been running for the last 15 years. And I think that like what the DOJ's proposed remedies in the Google case, where you have spinning off Chrome, requiring this kind of like data sharing with competitors. I think that that's a great way to kind of like just maintain this openness that we want to see in the AI market. And prevent, again, companies from using their existing assets to just kind of like co-opt the space. Because again, like all of these are choke points. The behavior, the reason that they could exert control over these choke points is because of the businesses that they've already established, and the assets they've already accumulated. So it's just making sure that they can't deploy those in a way that allows them to continue kind of rerunning the playbook.
And you mentioned in the piece specifically that Google is a player in absolutely every layer. They don't need, they can rely on absolutely no one else to sort of run their AI playbook. They're sort of a completely independent supply chain, theoretically, I guess. So are they the biggest concern here, or does obviously Amazon is bigger in terms of compute and cloud. Microsoft has the agreement with OpenAI. Are those the big three that you think deserve the most scrutiny here, the most worth watching? And are there any kind of differences in how they could leverage their power, or are they all just kind of like pretty super vertically integrated at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add to that list Meta, just because they're by virtue of releasing these kind of like open model, the Llama models, they can exert a lot of control in the model layer. And then just because of kind of like control over social media, they can exert a lot of power in the distribution channel layer. I think that each of the companies is kind of unique. The goal of that whole chart was to just kind of like highlight all of the areas that could be influenced, and then like each of these companies exert different power over different areas. So I think Google is interesting because they are simultaneously a cloud provider, a model developer, and then they control all of these really important distribution channels. I think Amazon is much more of a player in kind of the infrastructure layer and the distribution channel layer. Again, that if you consider these cloud environments to themselves be distribution channels, like the fact that Amazon is the biggest cloud computing company on the planet, it gives them enormous power there. Same with Microsoft. Even if they weren't partnering with OpenAI, they have a lot of, I mean, they're the second biggest cloud provider in the world, so they can control the choke point there. They developed the most widely used business productivity suite, like software suite in the world. So like that's a big distribution channel again, where we might see a lot of bundling. So I think the specifics vary company to company, but for the most part, it's like they all touch on at least kind of two of these choke points. I think Google is unique in that it really can like develop, deploy, and distribute an AI system without relying on anybody else. But I don't know.
We haven't talked too much about data. It comes up a lot in terms of, I think, like people talking about the value of the AI models. You sort of need like real-time data to keep them at a competitive or at a high level. Is that ostensibly some companies are doing licensing agreements with media companies, but obviously you can get data from being a search provider or being a social media company, and you can get data all different types of ways. How did that come up when you were looking at this in terms of data being not just either an incumbent advantage or also just weaponized generally in the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about it as in terms of incumbent advantage, just the sheer like the amount of proprietary data that each of these companies controls just gives them like a pretty significant advantage in developing these more like tailored tools that require this really high quality data. And then again, if like I think that if you consider data, not your own data, but like data that's out there that you need to be able to access, having all of this money that these companies have just gives them like a pretty big advantage. And they can they could sweeten those deals and just say like, oh, you can't provide this to anybody else. Like it's just I don't know, it's kind of it's a boring way of looking at it, but it's just the
No, I mean, I think financial subsidization, all that stuff comes up a lot in your cross subsidization. It comes up a lot in the report. I mean, it's kind of there throughout. It's just like, well, they can just lose money for longer than everyone else, and
and they could leverage the money to negotiate whatever terms they want with anyone that has something that they want. You know what I mean? It's just there's a lot of the money goes a long way.
Yeah, that sounds like extortion, but let's move on. Could you share your perspective on the prospects for antitrust action by DOJ and FTC in relation to market concentration in the AI sector? So that's a good way. Last question here. Good way to close things out. I mean, we could do this all day, I think.
Yeah.
Let's end on this. I mean, we've already got lawsuits against all of these companies except Microsoft, and you've got an active investigation into Microsoft role in or relationship with OpenAI. But more action. Your thoughts? I guess Trump administration. I guess how do you think about the Trump administration antitrust enforcers in terms of focusing on AI? I mean, it is kind of interesting because you've got Congress kind of saying, hey, let's take a hands-off approach. Maybe we'll do a 10-year moratorium here or ban on AI regulation. You had all those Doge Musk people in the government saying, hands off AI, let's let's use AI. I mean, but then you have this DOJ and FTC that's deeply skeptical of big tech's power and all these ongoing lawsuits. So it is a little bit of a confusing dynamic here to think about. What's your take on, is there interest here? Have you gotten interest from the paper so far? What do you think about the prospects for action here?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some degree, I think it's a good question. I think that we need to think about it kind of in terms of two buckets. So if you look at the kind of like pro innovation, pro AI, hands off, whatever that you see a lot of Republicans talking about now, my reading of that is that a lot of that has to do with kind of the AI governance stuff, a lot of the safety stuff, and not necessarily the market stuff. So I think that if you look at FTC and DOJ, like that, enforcing, like antitrust enforcement is not incompatible with like a 100% pro innovation approach to AI. So I'll be very interested to see how that continues to play out. I mean, I think that the fact, like we have seen the FTC and the Justice Department kind of continue on some of these cases and investigations that were started under the Biden administration. So I think that that's promising. I think that the one point of tension that I will be interested in following is not so much the anti-AI governance stuff, but the focus on subsidizing scale. So if you remember, I think it was back in January when Sam Altman announced this big, what was it called? It was the Stargate program or the Stargate project with White House. Like, I think that you within the national security community, you have still this idea that we need scale, we need all of this money, we need all of this compute. The government's job should be removing any barriers to building data centers and building the infrastructure that we need to continue pursuing scale. I think that is where you're going to see the real tension with kind of this pro competition community, because that is the people that are going to succeed if scale is just pursued is going to be the big tech companies. So more so than the governance stuff, I think that this idea of like, do we want more of a focus on efficiency, on small models, versus do we want these like big companies that are controlled, that can do these big models that can do everything, these God AI systems? Like, that is going to be what really rubs up against this like competition policy. And I really don't know how that's going to play out.
I think reading your report and talking to you, I find it just ironic that the incentives right now for big tech are towards inefficiency, right? Like in terms of energy, given that the whole argument historically to deregulate and weaken antitrust law and enforcement is that they're more efficient. And actually you have a business incentive to be inefficient here, which I find is just hilarious at some level. And then, sure. But I do think, look, if you're taking, I do think this is a, look, I think antitrust investigations have not deterred any real behavior by big tech. However, I do think that this market is a little bit different for the main reason being that there is this hidden billions of dollars, potentially more, of copyright risk. Mm-hmm. And that is got to be deeply concerning thing for any AI company, that if the FTC opens the hood, right? Look, I mean, maybe nothing would come of it, but you got to be a little bit nervous. You're getting a subpoena for someone to look at your model. You're getting a 6B to look at your model. All of a sudden, you've got, there are a lot of bodies buried there, probably. I mean, I would imagine. I mean, look, obviously, I don't know. Maybe they're not violating any IP, some of them, but certainly the lawsuits to this point suggests otherwise. You know, but maybe I'm being too you know, cynical. But look, this has been, as always, as my conversations with you always are, super interesting. Everyone should read this report. I imagine it will be, you know, a landmark paper here for anyone looking at regulation, looking at policy making, looking at strategic decision making in this market going forward. And I can't thank you enough for doing this. This was super, super interesting.
Oh, this has been a blast, and I really appreciate you guys having me on and taking an interest in the work.
All right, I look forward to staying in touch, and thanks.